She spent 100 nights in a row drinking with strangers to close a single business contract, a contract worth more money than her entire family had earned in a decade combined. Nobody forced her to say yes. This is the story of Maren Cole. That's the part people find hardest to believe when they hear this story later. So let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning, because you deserve to understand exactly what brought her to that table. Glass in hand, 97 nights, deep into a bet she wasn't sure she could win. Here's the question worth sitting with for a moment. Why would anyone do this to herself? It wasn't greed. You need to understand that first before anything else, because if you think this is a story about money, you're going to miss the whole point of it. It was about a highway, not a metaphorical one, an actual two-lane county highway outside Braddock Falls, Ohio, the one Maren's father used to drive every morning at 5 a.m. to get to the last operating steel mill in the county, back before it closed and took 1,100 jobs with it. It was about the house at the end of that highway, the one with the leak in the roof that nobody had the money to fix, the one where her mother, Ruth, still lived, still clipped coupons, still turned the thermostat down to 62 in January because the oil bill scared her more than the cold did. It was about her younger brother, Danny, 22 years old, sharp as anything, who'd had to defer his second semester of community college, twice because there wasn't enough left over after the bills to cover even the discounted tuition. Danny, who still slept in the room he'd had since he was 7, posters curling at the corners, dreaming about becoming an engineer and saying nothing about it anymore because dreaming out loud in that house had started to feel like an insult to everyone trying to keep the lights on. That was what this was about. Maren had done everything right. She was good at her job. But good wasn't always enough, not in an industry where half your competitors had gone to prep school with the men who signed the checks. Not when your boss, Grant Halloran, believed, quietly, but not quietly enough. So when the Voss account came up, a distribution contract worth just over $1 million a year, enough to keep the agency solvent through a rough fiscal quarter, and enough, frankly, to save several jobs, including her own. Richard Voss was 61 years old, built like a man who'd once played linebacker and never quite stopped eating like one, and he ran Voss Industrial Distribution the way he'd run it for 30 years, through relationships, not spreadsheets. He didn't want a pitch deck. He wanted to know if he liked you. And the way Richard Voss decided whether he liked someone was, unfortunately, over drinks. An old habit from his own climb up through the trade, back when deals were sealed in bars because nobody trusted a man who wouldn't sit down and have a beer with you. He's old school, Diane warned her, the day the account landed on Maren's desk. He'll want dinners, drinks. He tests people that way, sees who cracks, who complains, who can go the distance. It's not fair, it's not smart, but it's how he's always done it, and he's not going to change at 61 because we asked nicely. How many dinners are we talking? Maren had asked, still thinking, foolishly, that the answer might be 4 or 5. Diane had looked at her for a long moment. However many it takes for him to decide, he trusts you enough to sign. Could be 2 weeks, could be longer. Grant wants this contract, Maren. He is not going to let you say no. He didn't. The first night wasn't so bad. Neither was the 10th. It was somewhere around night 20, a Tuesday, she remembers, because Tuesdays were supposed to be her one night to see her friend Priya from the office, the only person there who'd actually grown up close to how she had, that Maren started to understand. This wasn't going to be a short campaign. Voss liked her. That was clear from the beginning. He laughed at her jokes. He asked about her family. He called her kid in a way that felt more paternal than condescending, but he wasn't ready to sign, and every dinner ended the same way. Another round, another laugh, another loose promise that they'd talk numbers soon. 30 nights in, she stopped being able to eat much at the dinners themselves. Her stomach had started rejecting the rich steakhouse food, the fried appetizers, the constant beer on top of beer. She started eating a small dinner alone at 5 p.m., something bland, rice and vegetables, just to have something in her system before the real meal of the evening began at 7. 50 nights in, she started keeping a case of ginger ale and a bottle of antacids in her desk drawer. 70 nights in, Priya found her in the office bathroom on a Wednesday morning, gripping the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. "You look like hell," Priya said, not unkindly, passing her a paper towel. "Thank you," Maren said. "That's exactly what I needed to hear before my 9 a.m. I'm serious, Mare. This has been going on for months. Have you talked to Diane?" "Diane knows." "Does Grant know?" Marin's silence answered that question well enough. What happened next surprised even Marin, because for months she had assumed the hardest part of this whole ordeal would be Richard Voss himself, the endless nights, the beer, the exhaustion. Trent was another account executive at the firm, ambitious in the specific, hungry way of a man who had never once had to wonder where his next paycheck was coming from, and he had wanted the Voss account from the beginning. When Grant assigned it to Marin instead, a decision Grant made not out of faith in her, she suspected, but because he knew a woman client managing an all-male account through months of dinners would generate a certain kind of talk, and talk, in Grant's world, was currency. Trent had smiled and congratulated her and said all the right things. And then, somewhere around night 80, the whispers started. She heard the first version of it secondhand, from Priya, who'd overheard it in the break room, that Marin was getting a little too close to Voss, that maybe that was the real reason he hadn't signed yet, that maybe he was stringing her along for reasons that had nothing to do with the contract. It was ugly, and it was baseless, and it was, in the particular cruelty of workplace gossip, entirely unfalsifiable. How do you prove a negative? She confronted Trent once, in the hallway outside the copy room, her voice low, and even because she refused to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her lose her composure. I don't know what you've been telling people, she said, but I'd be careful. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is this account. When it closes, it's going to have my name on it. Trent had shrugged all false innocence. I haven't said anything you should worry about, Marin. People just talk. People talk when someone gives them something to talk about. She walked away before he could answer, but that night at dinner she found herself watching Voss's associates a little more closely, wondering with a small cold feeling in her stomach whether the rumor had already made its way to the client's side of the table. It hadn't, not yet, but that wasn't the hardest part of what was still coming. There were good nights, too. There was the night, around night 40, when Voss's youngest associate, a quiet, nervous 26-year-old named Oscar, admitted after his third beer that he was terrified of disappointing his father, who'd built the company Voss had eventually bought out from under him, and Marin had talked him through it with more patience and more genuine care than the job required, and Oscar had looked at her like she'd handed him something valuable. Later, it would matter. A small kindness planted early, paying dividends nobody had asked for. There was the night Diane showed up unannounced at the restaurant, ostensibly to check in on the account, and quietly slipped the bartender $40 to water down Marin's next two beers without telling anyone at the table. "You'll thank me tomorrow," Diane murmured on her way out. There was the Sunday call with her mother, the one bright spot in every miserable week, when Ruth would ask in her careful way how the big project was going, never quite understanding what her daughter's job actually required of her, and Marin would say, and there was Danny, calling one night in October, his voice cracking with an excitement he was trying and failing to contain, to tell her he'd gotten accepted into the engineering transfer program at Ohio State, contingent, of course, on financial aid that hadn't come through yet, on a tuition gap that was still, technically, enormous. "I just wanted you to know," he said. "In case it doesn't work out, I wanted you to know I got in." "It's going to work out," Marin told him, sitting on the edge of her bed at 11 p.m., stomach still faintly sour from dinner. "I promise you, Danny, it's going to work out." She hung up the phone and sat very still for a long moment, looking at nothing, and then she got up and went to bed and got up again the next morning and went back to it. By night 90, something had shifted in her, though it took her a while to name it. She wasn't the same insecure kid from Braddock Falls who used to apologize for asking questions in college seminars, who used to shrink a little in rooms full of confident men. Something in her had hardened into something else, not bitterness exactly, but a kind of quiet, immovable resolve. She had started, without quite meaning to, negotiating differently, pushing back a little harder on small things, correcting Voss's associates when they mansplained the very industry she'd spent a year studying, laughing less to be liked and more. Voss noticed. "You've got some steel in you now, kid," he told her on night 93, tipping his glass toward her in something like a toast. "Wasn't sure you did back in July." "I always did," Marin said. "You just hadn't seen it yet." He laughed, a real laugh from the belly. "Fair enough. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was still 3 nights away, and it came from a direction none of them saw coming. On the night that would become night 98 in Marin's memory, though at the time she didn't yet know there would be a 99th, let alone a 100th. Richard Voss did not show up to dinner. His associate Oscar called 40 minutes before the reservation, his voice tight and strange. By the time Marin reached Voss's assistant the next day, she learned that Richard Voss had suffered a heart attack the previous evening. Mild, non-fatal, but serious enough that his cardiologist had ordered a minimum of 3 weeks of rest, no business, no travel, no stress of any kind. For one horrible, disorienting moment, sitting at her desk with the phone still in her hand, Marin felt something close to despair. Not because a man she'd come to genuinely respect and even like had just had a health scare, though she did feel that too, sharply, but because some small, ashamed corner of her mind immediately understood what this meant for the contract. She hated herself a little for that thought, and then Grant Halloran called her into his office and made her hate herself considerably less because he said, in front of Diane, that if the Voss deal didn't close by the end of the quarter, certain positions at the agency would need to be reevaluated, and everyone in the room understood exactly whose position he meant. That night, alone in her apartment, Marin sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 months, to cry. She thought about giving up. Really thought about it. Thought about calling Diane in the morning and saying she was done, that some things weren't worth what they cost, that Danny's tuition gap and her mother's oil bill and Grant Halloran's quarterly numbers were not, in fact, her responsibility to solve with her own body and her own exhausted evenings. She thought about it for exactly one night. In the morning, she sent Richard Voss a card, not an email, a real card, handwritten, dropped at his home address, which Oscar had reluctantly given her. It said nothing about the contract. It said she hoped he was resting, that his family was lucky to have him scared into slowing down for once, and that whenever he was ready, whenever not if, she'd be glad to pick things back up. She meant every word of it. 2 weeks later, Voss called her directly, his voice thinner than she remembered, but unmistakably his. "Nobody else from your firm sent me anything," he said. "How are you feeling?" Marin asked, ignoring the mention of Trent entirely. "Old," Voss said. "Old and stubborn, which the doctors tell me is a dangerous combination. Come see me. Not for business. I just want to talk." The final negotiation happened 3 weeks later, on what would become the 100th night, though it wasn't a dinner this time. Voss's cardiologist had banned the steakhouses and the beer entirely, and it wasn't even really a negotiation, not in the way Marin had once imagined it. It happened in Voss's study, over sparkling water and a plate of fruit his wife had insisted on, the two of them sitting across a low table, while Oscar hovered nearby with a folder of contract terms neither of them opened for the first 20 minutes. "You know why I made you do all this," Voss said finally. "It wasn't a question." "'Cause you wanted to see if I'd crack," Marin said. Marin said nothing. Her throat had gone tight. "I'm not proud of that part of it," Voss admitted. "It's an old man's way of doing business, and my own daughter tells me it's a bad way, and lying in that hospital bed, I had a lot of time to agree with her. But I want you to know, I saw it, all of it. The nights you were sick and came anyway, the card. I saw who you really are, Marin, and it's someone I want representing my company for the next 10 years, not just this contract." He slid the folder across the table. "Read it slowly," he said. "Take your time. There's no more testing left to do." She would tell you, if you asked her now, that she doesn't remember reading every clause of that contract. She remembers her hand shaking slightly as she signed her own name beneath his. She remembers Oscar quietly excusing himself to give them privacy, and Voss's wife bringing in a small pot of tea nobody drank. She remembers walking out to her car afterward and sitting behind the wheel for 10 full minutes before she trusted herself to drive, because the crying had started again, except this time it didn't feel like grief. She called her mother first, then Danny, then Diane, who cried harder than Marin did, which nobody expected. She did not call Grant Halloran until the following Monday. Trent Marsh said nothing at all. Here is what changed in the end, and it wasn't the money, though the money mattered. Danny's tuition gap closed within the month, and the roof on her mother's house got fixed before the first real snow, and none of that stopped meaning something just because it wasn't the point of the story. What changed was quieter than that. Marin stopped somewhere in that 100th night, being a woman who needed 100 nights of proving herself to believe she deserved a seat at any table. She had learned, the hard and slow way, that endurance wasn't the same thing as worth, that she hadn't earned Richard Voss's respect by drinking 100 beers she didn't want. She'd earned it by refusing to disappear, night after night, into someone smaller than she actually was. She still thinks sometimes about the version of herself who sat on her mother's porch as a girl, watching her father's truck disappear down that county highway every morning at 5, promising herself, without knowing yet what the promise would cost, that she would find some way out. She did find the way out. It just didn't look anything like she'd imagined it would, and it cost more than she ever expected to pay. And in the end, that was the whole complicated truth of it. Some things are worth exactly what they cost, and you don't always get to know that going in. That's the part she wants you to remember. It was never really about the $1 million. It was about refusing. And on the 101st night, for the first time in over 3 months, Maren Cole went home, made herself a cup of tea instead of pouring a drink, sat by her window, and simply rested.